The crown had not yet cooled on his head when Elder Voss stepped forward and named her. Not by her given name, not by any name that held warmth or weight or the particular dignity of a person with a history. He said it in the same voice he used for reading the tribute ledgers, flat and conclusive, and the hall received it without flinching. Bond debt, he said, and the word landed in the torchlight like a stone dropped into still water. Delivered in settlement of the Ashford Pack's outstanding obligation. One female, unmarked, unranked. She sits at the lower tier by custom and by law. Seren had known it was coming. She had known it from the moment the escort riders met her at the Forest Road 3 days ago and handed her a folded document that listed her beneath a column headed Assets Transferred. She had read it twice, noted her own name written in a different ink than the rest, and folded it back along its original crease. There was a kind of economy in being clear-eyed about a thing. It did not make the thing smaller. It only meant she would not waste time being surprised by it. She was 23 years old, the only remaining daughter of a pack elder who had borrowed against alliances he could not sustain, and she was now seated in the lowest tier of a crowning hall in a kingdom she had arrived at, dusty and silent at dusk, carrying one chest and a rolled blanket. The Alpha King, Darius Stoneheart, stood at the front of the hall on a dais of pale stone, and he did not look at her. The crown was iron, not gold. She noticed that. A plain, narrow band, hammered rather than cast, sitting on his dark hair with the settled authority of something that had waited for the right head. He was tall in the way that very still men often are, as though height were a side effect of economy rather than display. He received the ceremonial binding of his council's staffs without adjusting his posture. He spoke his oaths in a voice that did not climb. And when Elder Voss finished his recitation of the tribute inventory and moved to the matter of the political bond papers that Lady Mara's delegation had carried from the eastern provinces, Darius turned his head once, briefly, to the lower tier. His eyes found Seren for 2 seconds. Not 3. 2. Then he turned back. She told herself it meant nothing. A man cataloging the assets his inheritance had just acquired. She had been cataloged before. If you are watching this story for the first time, stay with it. The thing she decided in that moment will cost her more than she knew, and the thing he had already decided will not be spoken aloud for hours yet. She was given a room near the kitchen corridor, which was neither insulting nor comfortable, only functional. A boy named Fen, small and angular, with wolf's ears and the particular silence of someone who had learned not to take up space, appeared in the doorway carrying her travel chest. He set it down without a word, and then stood with his hands folded, watching her face to see if she would weep or rage. She did neither. She thanked him by name because he had told her his name in passing and she had kept it, and his surprise at being thanked was a small sharp thing she tucked away. A kitchen wolf named Brecca found her an hour later, arriving with a plate of bread and a sealed letter, which she pressed into Seren's hand with the studied casualness of someone who had rehearsed, not looking significant. "Keep it," Brecca said. "Don't read it in the corridor." Seren looked at the letter. It bore a wax seal she did not recognize, a device of 2 interlocked rings, and her name was written on the front in a hand that was not Brecca's. She put it in the bottom of her travel chest, under the spare dress, and did not open it. The first full day in the Stoneheart court began before dawn, because the tribute class was expected in the common yard for the morning count before the ranked wolves had risen. Seren stood in the yard in her gray dress, and the cold struck her at the collar and the wrists, but she kept her hands loose at her sides and answered when her name was called. 12 others stood in the tribute group, all of them careful, most of them young. She did not try to organize them. That was not her place here, and she knew the cost of exceeding your designated weight. The crowning day business continued into the second morning in the form of formal presentations. Each ranked house of the court presented its senior member before the new King's Council table. Elder Voss presided at the council table's end, which placed him at some remove from Darius, who sat at the table's head with his forearms resting flat on the stone surface, and his attention distributed across the room with the equitable calm of a man who had trained himself not to reveal preference. Seren was not presented. The tribute class did not receive formal introduction. She understood this. She sat at the back of the hall in a chair below the last ranked seat, which meant that she could see the room, but could not be easily seen, and she found herself studying the way the council operated when its new king was present for the first time. Voss ran the procedures. He knew where every scroll was. He spoke with the particular fluency of a man whose authority had gone unchallenged for long enough that he had stopped distinguishing between custom and personal preference. When a young junior member made an error in the reading of a bond attestation, Voss corrected him without looking up from his own document, and the correction was technically accurate and entirely humiliating, and no one in the room indicated that either of those things had occurred. Darius said nothing during this correction. He watched Voss. It was not possible from where Seren sat to read the specifics of his expression, only its quality, and its quality was patient. Privately, in the place behind her ribs where she had learned to hold observations that were not safe to have, she thought, "He is counting something." The seating for the evening hall required that the tribute class be placed at the rear of the gallery, in chairs behind a wooden divider, technically inside the hall, and technically not at the gathering. Seren had been told this by one of the house servants, who explained it without apology, and with the faint gentleness of someone delivering information they had not written. She found her chair, which was behind the divider and offered a partial view of the main table through a gap in the carved screen. She had just settled when a council aide moved through the gallery and stopped in front of her. "Elder Voss has indicated the tribute placement is farther back," the aide said. He gestured toward the wall. Seren stood to move. "Leave her." The voice came from the front of the room. Not loud. It did not need to be loud. Darius was speaking to the aide, not to Seren, and he did not look up from the document he was reviewing, but the instruction was clear and the aide received it with a brief compression of his jaw and then withdrew. Seren sat back down. She did not look toward the front of the hall. She kept her eyes on the carved screen and the gap through which she could see the table, and she told herself this meant nothing beyond an administrative correction. A new king establishing the limits of his council's reach. It was not about her specifically. She was a piece of furniture that had been moved by a junior aide, and a king who noticed small disruptions had corrected it. This was the explanation that asked nothing of her. She kept it. Calder was seated 2 chairs to Darius's right, as the king's beta held by convention, and he had seen the small exchange with the aide. He noted, without making it visible in his posture, that Darius had returned to his document without checking whether the correction had been received. He did not need to check. He had known it would be received. What interested Calder was the quickness of it. The fact that the instruction had been issued before the aide had finished speaking to the woman, as though the king had been tracking the back of the gallery before the movement gave him reason to. The false bond document arrived on the 3rd morning of Seren's time in the court, though she did not know immediately what it was. A clerk brought it to the archive room where she had been assigned sorting work, because the tribute class was assigned work according to the house's current needs, and the current need was the organizing of bond records from the previous king's reign. The archive was a long, narrow room below the main corridor, lit by 2 oil lamps that Seren had asked to be moved closer to the work table, and it smelled of tallow and dry leather. The document the clerk laid on the table was a single page, 1 seal pressed in dark wax, 1 signature line, with her name already inscribed above it in the same hand she had seen on Brecca's sealed letter, though she had not yet opened that letter and could not be certain. Her name, and below it, a line for her mark. She read the document carefully. It was a bond attestation, written in the legal form of the court, which established that she acknowledged her debt tribute status and accepted the terms of transfer to the current holder of the Stoneheart throne, to be held at his discretion for a period of service without fixed duration. It was not the first document she had been asked to sign in her life. She had signed the tribute ledger on arrival. She had signed the acknowledgement of house placement. Those were records of fact, and she had no quarrel with records of fact. This was not a record of fact. This was a claim written to look like a record, and the distinction was the difference between a door standing open and a door locked from outside. She set down the document. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the lamp nearest to her, and tried to think without the sound of her own blood interfering. She was not naive about what a refusal would cost. She was one person in the lowest tier of a court she had arrived at 3 days ago, with one chest and a rolled blanket. Refusal would be characterized as breach of tribute agreement. It would go back to Voss, who would take it to the council, and the council would write something that made her position considerably worse. She was still sitting with her hands flat on the table when the door to the archive opened. She turned. Darius Stoneheart stood in the doorway of the archive room with the particular quality of a man who had arrived from somewhere specific and was now taking in what he found. He looked at her hands on the table. He looked at the document. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes completed a calculation. "You haven't signed it," he said. "No," she said. A pause followed, long enough that the oil lamp on the left made a small sound, a settling of the wick. "Tell me why," he said. She looked at him directly, which she had not done in any of the preceding days, having learned to address a point just past the shoulder of anyone with authority enough to take offense. She looked at his face and found it, at this proximity, more complicated than it had appeared from the back of the gallery. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, too old to have a recent story, and his eyes held the particular expression of someone who was asking a question he already knew at least one answer to. "Because it says, 'I accept service without fixed duration,'" she said. "And because the word 'accept' in this context is not accurate. I was sent here. I did not choose to come. The document claims an agreement between two parties, but only one party is being asked to sign. That is not an agreement. That is a record of ownership in agreement's clothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Elder Voss wrote this document," he said. "I imagined he might have," she said. He looked at the document on the table for a moment that ran longer than was casual. Then he looked at her again. She had the sensation, not comfortable, of being understood by something much larger than her understanding of herself. "Leave the document unsigned," he said. He left. She stood in the archive room for a long time after he had gone, listening to the sound of the lamps and the distant ordinary sounds of the house above her, and she tried to tell herself this was another administrative correction and not something she did not yet have language for. She was not certain she succeeded. The following morning she encountered him in the main corridor between the archive stairwell and the East Gallery. He was walking with Calder, talking in the low, terse manner of two men in the middle of a working conversation, and she was coming from the opposite direction with an armful of resorted bond records bound in strips of leather. They would have passed each other. There was room in the corridor for it, and the customary thing, the expected thing, was for the tribute class to step aside and keep their eyes lowered and let ranked members of the house move without adjustment. She stepped aside. She lowered the armful of records slightly, so the leather bindings would not catch on anyone's coat, and she looked at the floor. He slowed. Not much. A shortening of stride that lasted only as long as they were adjacent. She felt it more than she saw it. A change in the air of the corridor, the way the ordinary sounds of the house seemed to hold their breath. His sleeve was very close to her arm. There was perhaps 2 fingers' width between the wool of his coat and the worn linen of her dress, and neither of them moved for a moment that was precisely too long to be accidental. Then Calder said something quiet behind him, a name or a word she could not hear, and Darius moved forward, and the corridor returned to its ordinary temperature, and she stood against the wall until their footsteps had gone around the corner. She walked the rest of the way to the archive room without thinking about it. She filed the records with attention and precision and did not think about it at all. Lady Mara arrived on the 5th day. She came from the eastern provinces with a party of 12 riders and 3 house servants and a case of political bond papers drawn up by Mara's own council and co-signed by 3 eastern elders. And she arrived at the Stoneheart Court with the particular ease of a woman who had been told all her life that rooms organize themselves around her arrival. She was beautiful in the deliberate, well-resourced way of someone who had never needed to be economical about beauty. Her traveling coat was the color of deep winter water, and her hair was dressed as though she had not spent 3 days on horseback, which had certainly required effort. And she greeted Elder Voss in the outer hall with the warmth of 2 people who had corresponded about this visit before the new king knew it was planned. Seren saw the arrival from the upper gallery, where she had been carrying a stack of linen for the linen press room. She paused at the gallery rail and watched the greeting below. She did not think about the political bond papers specifically. She thought about the way Voss's shoulders had dropped a fraction at Mara's arrival, the relief of a man whose arrangement was arriving on schedule. Fen materialized at her elbow 2 hours later, appearing without announcement in the way he had already established as his particular talent. Voss is presenting the Eastern bond papers to the council this evening, he said, very quietly. Lady Mara will be there. Her name is on the papers as the proposed bond partner for the king. Seren looked at the wall. There is a second matter, Fen said. He was looking at his hands. He has also sent a second clerk to the archive to retrieve the document you did not sign. He is going to present it to the council as evidence of bond debt violation. Seren descended the gallery stairs at a speed that was not quite running and reached the archive room ahead of the second clerk. By a margin she could not precisely estimate, but guessed at roughly the length of one wrong turn in an unfamiliar corridor. She took the unsigned document from the table and put it inside the leather cover of a bond record from 30 years ago, which she then placed back on the shelf in its correct position among 60 nearly identical volumes. The second clerk arrived 2 minutes later, looked at the empty table, looked at her sorting records at the far end of the room, and left to report that the document was not where it had been left. She stood at the shelf and let her hands stop trembling before she went back to her work. That evening the council presented Lady Mara in the great hall, which had been laid with the second-tier candles, taller and more numerous than the usual hall lighting, giving the room a ceremony it had not worn since the crowning. Seren was seated, by the earlier corrected arrangement, at the gap in the carved screen in the back gallery. She watched Voss present the Eastern Alliance. He had a gift for making political necessity sound like something being offered rather than something being collected, and he presented the bond papers with the particular grace of a man who was confident that the outcome had already been arranged and was only waiting for the form to be satisfied. Lady Mara stood beside the council table with her hands clasped and her head at the precise angle of someone who had practiced receiving a very good outcome with apparent modesty. Darius sat at the head of the table. He read the bond papers. He took considerable time with them, enough time that Voss had to maintain his expression of easy confidence for longer than was comfortable. And when Darius finally set the papers on the table, he looked up, not at Voss and not at Mara, and the place his eyes rested for half a second was the carved screen at the back of the gallery. Seren sat very still. He looked back at the table. I accept the papers for review, he said. Voss's shoulders descended with the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for exactly as long as it takes to cross a room. The gallery was very cold in the hours after the session closed. Seren sat in the chair behind the screen and did not move for a long time, and the candles in the main hall were extinguished one by one as the servants made their rounds, and the darkness came in by degrees, until the only light left was the narrow stripe of moonlight through the high window at the gallery's end. He had accepted the papers. It was law in the Stoneheart court, and had been law for 3 generations of Stoneheart kings, that a political bond accepted in open council moved to formal attestation within a single turning of the moon. The false bond document in the archive was now immaterial. If the Eastern Alliance formalized, her status as tribute debt under the court's existing obligation would be subsumed into whatever administrative reshaping followed the new bond. She would be transferred, recategorized, or released back to an Ashford pack that no longer wanted her. She was very tired. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the travel chest in the corner. She opened it. She took out the spare dress, the rolled wool stockings, the folded traveling papers. She took out the sealed letter from Brecca, the one she had put aside because there had not yet been a moment quiet enough to open it in, and she broke the seal. The letter was written in a small, compact hand on a single folded sheet. It was not from Brecca. Brecca had only been the delivery. The letter had been written by a woman named Alara, who had served the previous Stoneheart king as an archivist and who had died before Seren arrived in this court, which explained why the letter had been sealed and waiting rather than handed directly. Alara wrote that she had known Seren's mother, that Seren's mother had been a Stoneheart ward, a daughter of the Ward bloodline, which was not the same as the main bloodline, but was recognized by Stoneheart pack law as a claim to named standing under the current throne. That this had been concealed from Seren's father when the Ashford alliance was arranged, because the Ward blood claim would have complicated the tribute terms, and Voss had been the one to suppress the documentation. Seren read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, she was aware that her hands were not trembling, which surprised her slightly, and then she understood that the trembling had already happened and she had simply not noticed it. She folded the letter along its original crease and placed it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat. She began to pack the chest. She was going to leave at first light, not because she was afraid, because she was clear-eyed about what a person without standing could accomplish in a court that had just accepted the paperwork for its king's new bond partner, and because staying to fight a claim she could not yet prove, in a court where the one man who might have listened had just accepted the Eastern Alliance papers in open council, was not stubbornness. It was the particular stubbornness that wears a mask of strategy. She was at the eastern gate with her chest and her rolled blanket, in the gray pre-dawn that sits between dark and the first cold light, when Fen found her. He was breathless, which meant he had been running, and he held a sealed document in one hand with the pressure of someone carrying something they are afraid will dissolve if they loosen their grip. "He sent this," Fen said. "He said to give it to you before you reach the gate. He said specifically before the gate, and I nearly missed you." She looked at the document. The seal was Stoneheart iron, the device of the throne, and her name was written on the front in a hand she had not seen before, but which, for reasons she could not account for, she recognized in the way you recognize the shape of a room you once walked through in darkness. She broke the seal. The document was 1 page. It contained 7 words in Darius Stoneheart's own hand, which she would verify later against the bond record signatures and find to be correct. And those 7 words were, "Come to the hall before moonrise. Please." The word at the end was not the custom of kings. The word at the end was the cost of writing it. Visible in the slight pressure the pen had made on the paper at the place where he had set it down differently than he had lifted it. She stood at the gate for a long moment. She picked up her travel chest. She turned back toward the hall. The hall at the turning of pre-dawn to early dark is a different place than the hall at ceremony. The torches in the iron brackets had been relit, all of them, which was not the custom for any council session she had seen, and the stone floor held the reflection of the light in long, wavering lines. The ranked wolves of the Stoneheart court stood in their formal positions along the walls, which told her this had been called as a witnessed session, but the candles of the second tier were not lit, and the council table had not been arranged for deliberation. Voss stood at the council's customary position with his scrolls and his composed expression, and the barely discernible quality of a man who had not been informed in advance. Lady Mara stood to the left of the dais in her winter water coat, her composure showing at its edges the first fine lines of something that was not quite certainty. Calder stood at Darius's right hand, and when Seren came through the door with her travel chest and her rolled blanket and the letter from a dead archivist in the inside pocket of her coat, Calder's expression held a flicker of what might, in a different man, have been visible relief. Darius stood at the front of the dais on the pale stone, and he was not wearing ceremony. He was wearing what he had worn in the archive room, the plain working coat, and he looked at her the moment she came through the door and kept looking. She crossed the hall. She did not look at Voss. She did not look at Mara. She walked the length of the stone floor in borrowed gray and set her travel chest down at the foot of the dais steps and looked up at him. "You sent for me," she said. "I did," he said. He came down one step. "I want to show the court something first," he said. He was speaking at a volume the hall could hear, and she understood this was deliberate. "Calder." Calder stepped forward and laid a bond record volume on the dais. It was 30 years old and bound in worn leather, and Seren recognized it immediately because she had placed the false bond document inside it 2 days ago in the archive room, and she had not told anyone where she had put it. Darius opened the volume and removed the single page. He held it so the hall could see the blank signature line. "Elder Voss," he said. Voss said, "That document is a standard bond attestation, required by court custom for all tribute members. The tribute class signs on arrival. The delay in processing was administrative." "Her name was inscribed before she arrived," Darius said. "The ink on her name is 3 days older than the ink on the heading. The court archivist confirmed this at my request this morning." The silence in the hall had a specific texture. It was not the silence of a room waiting for explanation. It was the silence of a room watching an explanation fail. Voss said, "The precedent for pre-registration of tribute names is established in the secondary bond codes." "Calder," Darius said again. Calder brought forward a second document. This one Seren had not seen before. It was a letter, and even at this distance she could see that it had been written in the same small compact hand as Alara's letter in her coat pocket. Darius read it aloud. Not all of it. He read the section that named Seren's mother as a Stoneheart ward, and the section that described how the ward blood claim had been removed from the tribute documentation before the Ashford arrangement was finalized, and the name of the person who had ordered the removal. Voss said nothing. He said nothing because there was nothing to say to a dead archivist's letter in a king's hand, read aloud before full court witnesses, and Seren watched his face in the torchlight and saw, for one unguarded instant, a very old man discovering that the thing he had suppressed had simply waited. Darius looked at Seren. He came down the second step. "The false bond document is void," he said, still at hall volume. "The ward blood claim is recognized. The Ashford debt tribute is dissolved." He looked at her for a moment in which the hall and the torches and the ranked witnesses and the whole particular weight of a kingdom's hierarchy waited at the edges of a very small space between them. Then he said quietly, at a volume not calculated for the hall, "I have been the wrong kind of quiet this week." It was not an apology in the shape of a speech. It was a man setting something down at her feet with both hands. She looked at his face and found it as complicated as it had been in the archive room, and the scar along his jaw was the same, and his hands were at his sides with the particular openness of someone who was not reaching for anything yet. "The Eastern bond papers," she said. "Were accepted for review," he said, "not for attestation. I wanted the council to see them in front of witnesses before I declined them." He paused. "I needed a reason the council would accept. The ward blood claim provides one." "Is that the only reason?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. He raised his hand and held it open, palm up, at the level of her shoulder, not reaching for her, offering. "Seren," he said. Her name in his voice was a new kind of weight, not the weight of inventory or record or the Tribune ledger's ink. "I am asking in front of this court, in front of Calder, who has watched me watch you since the crowning, in front of every ranked house that believed I would not, because I want them to know what I know." He did not look away. "Will you stay?" he said. "At my hand." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She reached up and put her hand in his. His fingers closed, not with the grip of possession, but with the particular care of someone handling the first thing of real value they have been trusted with, and she felt the warmth of his palm against hers, and something in her chest that had been braced for approximately 23 years released a fraction of its tension. He turned to face the hall. He lifted their joined hands. The hall bent. Not quickly, not all at once. It moved in the way that very old things move when they finally accept a necessary weight. First the betas at the edge of the room, then the junior house members, then the senior houses, the long, slow wave of acknowledgement traveling from the walls inward. Lady Mara's people bowed with a precision that was entirely correct and entirely unhappy. Mara herself inclined her head by the exact measure that a woman of her standing owed to a recognized consort claimant of the throne, and the precision of her correctness was the most honest thing she had done since arriving. Voss stood with his scrolls and did not bow, and then, after a moment that the entire hall counted, lowered his head by a fraction, because the court archivist was standing 8 feet away with a copy of Alara's letter and a decade's accumulated record weight, and refusing to bow in this room was no longer a viable position. Fen was standing at the back of the hall. He had slipped in after Seren, carrying nothing, just himself. And when the hall bent, he pressed his forearm against his mouth, and his eyes were very bright. Darius took Seren's hand from the raised position and brought it down and held it at his side, which was the position of a person you intended to keep beside you. And he said to the hall in the voice that did not need volume, "The Ward bloodline is restored. The tribute record is amended. Her standing is witnessed." The court held it. The false bond document remained on the dais. Darius took it from where Calder had placed it and held it over the nearest torch, and the paper caught at the corner and burned with the particular speed of something that had been waiting to be unmade. He held it until the last of the seal's wax fell black and cooling to the stone floor, and then he set down the edge of it and looked at her again, with the expression of a man who had just released the last weight of a long, wrong road. The coda arrived not in the hall, but in the morning that followed. Seren walked the main corridor from the east gallery to the archive stairwell, which she had walked 3 times carrying records and once carrying the particular weight of a corridor that had held them both for 2 full seconds. She walked it without her travel chest, without the rolled blanket, without the borrowed gray dress, which had been exchanged at Calder's quiet arrangement for wool, the color of deep heather, with a proper collar and buttons that fit. Brecca passed her at the kitchen corridor's entrance and stopped and bowed. Not deeply, not in the ceremonial manner, but the specific bow of one person to another who has been correctly seen, and then Brecca smiled with the entirety of her face and moved on. Fen was waiting at the archive stair with a new arrangement of lamp oil for the room below, because Seren had mentioned once that the lamps ran low by midday and he had apparently noted it. He handed her the oil without ceremony and then said, "I knew when he slowed in the corridor," as though they were in the middle of a conversation they had been having for days. "What corridor?" she said. "3 days ago," he said. "With Calder. You stepped aside and he slowed down. I was at the end of the passage. I saw his pace change." He paused. "I thought you should know that it was not only last night." She went down to the archive room. The old bond records were in their ordered positions on the shelf, the 30-year-old volume sitting at its correct place among the others, nothing remarkable about it from the outside. The work table was clear, the two oil lamps were low as they usually were by this hour, and she filled them from the flask Fen had brought, and the room brightened by a degree that was small, but specific. She sat at the work table for a moment in the brightened room and placed both hands flat on the surface, which she had done once before in this room under very different terms, and felt the difference in what her hands expected from the stone. Darius found her there an hour later, which she had not planned and did not believe was accidental, and he sat across from her at the work table with his forearms resting flat, in the same position he had taken at the council table, and they talked about the ward blood documentation and what the restoration would require, and how long the formal process typically needed, and these were practical matters, and they discussed them with precision. At some point, the practical matters resolved themselves. The room was quiet. He was still there. She looked at his hands on the table, and they were open. Not performing openness. Simply open. The way hands are when a person is no longer holding anything back. She understood that this was what he had asked for on the dais. Not only her standing, not only the dissolution of the false bond, not only the ward blood restoration before the ranked court. He had asked, in the archive room's quiet and the corridor's 2-second pause and the 7-word letters final word, for this specific ordinary thing. Two people at a table in a brightened room. Her hands on the stone. His hands open beside them. The lamplight between them. Steady now.